Hello and welcome to the fifth lecture on the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. Now, in this week, we have been talking about various aspects of language. We began talking about concepts and categories in the first class, then we talked about semantic networks. In the last lecture, if you remember, I talked about connectionist networks. Today, I am going to talk about a slightly broader frame of knowledge, and this frame of knowledge is referred to as schemas, and we'll also talk a little bit about scripts, which are a particular kind of a schema. Now, we've talked about concepts as a currency of knowledge, we've talked about concepts as units of knowledge. However, knowledge is not merely decomposable into units. We generally deal with knowledge in our daily lives as broader aspects. So, we do not really talk about only specific concepts. If you remember, we talk about things in a much broader frame of mind. You could talk about what happens when you go to a restaurant, or you could talk about what happens when you go to visit a cricket match, what happens when you are planning to, let us say, make tea, or go to somebody's marriage, having a birthday party. Any aspect of daily life that you would want to talk about, each of that basically, or you're talking of each of these things, represents slightly broader concepts than just, say, for example, a concept of a canary or a concept of a cake that we've been talking about. So, today I'll try and guide you through some of the theories, some of the psychological theories about these broader aspects of knowledge, which are referred to as schemas. So, cognitive processes handle these units, and this generalized knowledge about the world, this generalized knowledge which might contain so many different concepts all organized in a particular manner, these are referred to as a schema. So, you might have a schema for, let us say, making tea, you might have a schema for let us say, as I was mentioning, going to a birthday party and stuff like that. Now, schemas, if you think of them, and if you kind of take a step back and try and introspect, what are these different schemas that you're dealing with, and how are these different schemas influencing your daily interactions, how are these different schemas influencing your understanding of the world. So, it said that schemas do influence our understanding of a situation, of an event, and they might also bias us, let us say, or get us into anticipating or expecting what is going to happen in the next moment. Now, let us take a very simple example. If you are going to a birthday party, what would you expect? Your schema of a birthday party includes these many things. It includes, there is certainly somebody whose birthday that is. It includes, let us say, nice food. It would include guests. It would include presents, maybe. It would include a cake, for example. And as soon as somebody comes to you and tells you that you have to come to my birthday party and it's on such and such date, all of these things, all of these things you are automatically going to anticipate, and you're going to kind of sometimes organize your behavior around these anticipations. Now, that is the most interesting part of knowledge that we can talk about. That's one of the very interesting aspects about, and that's probably knowledge in common parlance. That's what you say, for example, mean when you talk about that I have the knowledge of what it means to go to a birthday party. You're probably talking about this schema wherein all of these little concepts are organized in a particular manner. Also, schemas might be considered useful in explaining how people might process slightly more complex situations and slightly complex events. Say, for example, if there is a marriage. Now, marriage is a complicated event, and there are so many rituals, and there is so much to that happens when somebody is getting married. So, as soon as you say, as soon as you mention marriage to somebody, they might already be activating all of these ideas related to marriage, whatever their experience has been, whatever they have gathered out of the word marriage, and whatever they've heard of what goes on in particular marriages. So, the idea is you kind of, as soon as you mention these words, you're giving them a snapshot into what all can be expected. This is the kind of knowledge which we are going to talk about today in more detail. Now, this knowledge I keep mentioning, all of these facts that you are kind of getting as soon as I'm mentioning, let us say, a birthday party or a marriage or a restaurant, is basically you can term it as generic information. So obviously from particular marriage to other marriage, or from somebody's birthday party to a different person's birthday party, the details might change here and there. The details might not be exactly the same in all of these birthday parties, but you have a generic idea about what happens in birthday parties usually. Now, this generic information about a particular situation or about a particular event is what people store in their memory, and they use this information to understand and remember new examples of particular kinds of schemas. Say for example, you would have some generic information about any particular event, and you could say for example, if somebody is asking you to recall one of the earlier birthday parties that you have been to, uh, it is quite possible that you might not remember the exact details of what went on in that particular party, but you will use your schema to actually bring on and kind of construct a narrative around that schema. I was there, and there was nice food there, and these people, this person got so many gifts, etc., etc. Sometimes even though you might not clearly remember these particular facts, but the schema comes to the rescue for memory, and you kind of try and generate this narrative structure because using the help of your schema. Also, if you talk about the future, as I already mentioned in a few minutes ago, that schemas also allow you to predict what will happen in a new situation sometimes. Say for example, you've never been to a particular place. Say for example, you migrate to a different country and you go somewhere where somebody's invited you to their marriage. Now the idea is you might have never been to that kind of a marriage. Say for example, you might never have been to a Jewish wedding for that matter, and you're in Europe and you're going to this person's wedding. You might have some idea about what goes on in these weddings from whatever you've heard. So you've generated a schema, and on the basis of that schema, you're kind of predicting, you're kind of anticipating what all is going to happen at that point in time. So schemas not only help you in some sense to gather information, organize information, to recollect information, it also helps you to predict what might happen in a new situation. So schemas can be used as heuristics or general rules that are mostly accurate, because it's very rarely that instances or say for example exemplars of such kind of events or things vary too much from each other. So if you have an idea of what happens in a party or what happens in a marriage, you already have enough information to say for example navigate that event in some sense. Moving further, schemas also tell us something about how cognition actually takes place. It tells us about that we are not really passively experiencing events, we are also actively participating and anticipating events. So we are basically anticipating whatever incoming information is going to come, we are evaluating it, we are comparing it with the schema that we already have. You have this feeling of I knew this would happen in a lot of scenarios. In some scenarios where I knew this would happen does not really make sense, and you are say for example encountering a really new situation, say for example which does not reconcile with the idea. Say for example you go to a Jewish wedding and you find some ritual that you hadn't even thought of and you did not really expect. A lot of times you would try and understand why this was there. Was it something that generally happens? Is it something particular to this particular wedding? Things like that. So anytime that the incoming information, new information, if you are in a new situation, is not consistent with your schemas that you already are holding, you would make all the efforts to actually try and reconcile that with your schema. You will either try to update your schema, or you will either try to say for example check the source of why this new variation is there, and maybe make note for later. So schemas, so this is all about how schemas can be useful in navigating around the world, in understanding the world, in anticipating information, etc. But because I am talking at the level of schemas, it might seem all too generic, and you might be wondering that a lot of times things happen that are not consistent with schemas. What happens then? So schemas also lead us to make particular kinds of mistakes. Say for example, Davis and Loftus did some research and showed that a lot of times people anticipate on the basis of their schema what is going to happen. So the idea is you are kind of preempting phenomena before they are happening, and there is a high chance that any new something new will occur, and your anticipations and predictions might not be right. It does not happen all the time, but it might happen a few times as well. So schemas in that sense, say for example, also are very useful in fields like social psychology, when you're talking about social cognition, social perception, etc. So the idea is, and Baldwin and Dandino did this research, and they basically were trying to examine how people have schema based expectations about what will happen in their interactions, in their social interactions with particular people. Say for example, you're going to meet let us say a very high ranking official of the military, or say for example you're going to meet the principal of a particular college, or you're going to meet a lawyer. Now if you have not really met either of these individuals before, you might actually go with certain kind of schema based expectations, and you might organize your behavior all around that. Say for example, somebody is going to meet a high ranking army official, might already have the schema that this person is going to be very strict, he might not be funny at all, and I have to be behave in my best possible manner. But if you go and you meet this person, and this person turns out to be the opposite, jovial, very friendly, etc., etc., you might kind of you are in a slight soup, because you've made this mistake of over anticipating the particular situation. So again, it's not all the time correct, but a lot of times schemas give you good predictions, and that is how schemas are useful to us. Now let us talk a little bit about a particular kind of a schema. Let us talk about script. Now a script is a special kind of schema wherein you have you have anticipated a well structured sequence of events which are occurring in that very specified order, and it's generally associated with a highly familiar activity. So you might have a script for making tea. Now making tea is basically something that you will do in a particular manner. You will do that over and over again, and you will do that in that same sequence. Say for example, you will put the water to boil, you will probably add the tea leaves then, and you will add sugar, and then maybe you will add milk, and you will do that most often than not in a particular sequence, and that sequence is also going to be obeyed more often than not. So such kind of schemas where you have a very sequential arrangement of events, all of them happening one after the other, is called a script. Uh, Trying to formally define a script is an abstraction. It's basically a prototype of a series of events that share an underlying similarity. So the idea is I'm going to make tea. All of these are parts of what making tea is all about. So the terms schema and script, you will see in literature sometimes they are used interchangeably, but the fact is that script is actually a much narrower term. So it's also a schema, but it's a schema which is much narrower in nature. There is this sequence of things that has to happen, whereas schema might be slightly more generic in nature. Say for example, a typical a script maybe one describing the standard sequence of events that a customer expects when the customer goes in a particular restaurant. So the idea is the restaurant script should include looking at the menu, ordering the food, eating the food, paying the bill, and let us say paying the tip and coming off. You could have similar tips for, say for example, going to a dentist, going to a particular doctor, etc. So these are schemas, yes, but these are more specific schemas. These are schemas which are associated to sequential steps, sequential events happening one after the other in the same order. A violation of a familiar script, just like violation of schemas I was talking about, can be both surprising and unsettling. For if you go to a dentist and you are expecting that my tooth is not well, and most probably I will be advised for the tooth extraction or tooth removal, but the dentist on the other hand says there is some hope and you should probably try something, some alternative therapy, maybe use this medicine for some time, and we're not really ready for tooth extraction right away. So the idea is you will both be surprised, and sometimes people might be unsettled if their expectations are thwarted in a particular manner. So the idea is that obviously our world revolves around these kind of schemas, but it might often be a good idea to not really put too much weight on these kind of anticipations and these kind of expectations. Okay, so research has shown, talking about the kind of research that has been done with the schemas, so research has shown that people recall a script significantly more accurately if the script has been clearly identified in advance. So what do I mean by identified in advance? Say for example, uh, you go to a particular place, and say for example you go to a restaurant. As soon as somebody is inviting you to go to a restaurant, as soon as you enter the place, as soon as you are getting ready for the place, you already create this anticipation, you already create that okay, this is what I am going to do. On the other hand, in cases it might happen that says for example somebody told you that I'm going to take you to a particular place, but I'm not going to tell you, and you suddenly discover that it's a very very high quality restaurant, a fine dining place, and then because your schema for such a high quality, such a 5-star kind of a place might be slightly different from than your local canteen or your local mess, these two scripts might be very different from each other, and you might really feel very surprised, sometimes unsettled, etc. But if somebody gives you a clue that or say for example if you can already identify that this is what is going to happen, you will remember these events much better. You will kind of organize your behavior around that. So they wanted to do this study, Trofimov and Weyer in 1993. They developed 4 different kind of scripts. Say for example, very simple events: photocopying a piece of paper, encashing a check, making tea, and taking the subway. So they basically developed scripts for all 4 of these events, and also added some irrelevant filler details for participants to remember. So the participants were made to remember all 4 of these events. In some cases, when this script was there, in some cases the script identifying event was presented first, and in some cases it was presented at the last. Say for example, put the water to boil. If put the water to boil is presented in first, you would already start assuming that maybe tea is going to be made, and you would automatically remember this slightly better. So the idea is, they asked their participants 5 minutes after reading all the 4 descriptions, they asked their participants to recall the 4 original descriptions that were given. Now, in cases where the script identifying events were presented first, participants could recall 23% of those events in comparison to only 10% of the events when the script identifying events were presented at last. So as soon as you can identify the script, the entire sequence comes to your memory and you'll recall it better. In cases when the the script identifying event was presented at the last, you probably were not organizing this stuff as well in your brain. So that is probably what leads to misremembrance or less memory for events which for scripts wherein you have not identified the script initially already. Now, events, so that's pretty much what happened with the study. Let us try and understand how these schemas might be operating through these various cognitive processes that we have. So, it has been said the selection of information. So, schemas influence the selection of information to be remembered. Whatever event is happening at a point in time, if you have particular schemas, the schemas might influence which information, which parts of the information, which parts of the event or the episode that is what you will remember correctly, and which you will not pay too much attention on. Boundary extension, say for example, sometimes when you store a particular visual scene in the memory, sometimes it might happen that when you are asked to recall this, you might recall a little bit more than you actually saw. We will talk about all of these details in a while. Well, I will detail all of these aspects. Schemas are also helpful during abstraction. Say for example, when you try and memorize the gist but not really the specific details, because as soon as I tell you that I am going to talk about a birthday party, and I start giving you very many boring details about the birthday party I was last night, you might just remember the word birthday party, hold the gist, and not really pay attention to a lot of details that I might be mentioning. During interpretation, also schemas are very helpful. Say for example, when you have to make inferences about new information that was not there already. Say for example, if I am describing a terrorist attack somewhere or something like that, Now you might basically already have a schema of what happens when such attacks are happening, and you might basically interpret all the close by events with that frame of mind. So that's also one of the things, one of the manners in which schemas actually influence people's cognition. Also, schemas might influence integration of information. I'll again talk about this in more detail later, but I can give you an idea that when you need to form a single representation of so many different events that have happened at a particular point in time, your schema might help you organize this in a particular way than you would have otherwise organized this information. So let us talk about all of these things in a bit more detail now. Now let us first talk about schema and memory selection. So it has been shown that there is enhanced memory for schema consistent material. Brewer and Tyson, they asked participants to wait one at a time in a room. So I'll show you this room here. You can quickly have a look at this, and then if I ask you to tell me what all you saw in this room, how well would you be able to recall? So can you can pick up a pen and start writing down what you saw, or I can tell you that that room was the picture of my office, and then you can try and recall and write down whatever you saw there. What do you think, which of the two scenarios will lead to more recall? So this is pretty much the experiment that Brewer and Tyson did in 1981. They basically explained, they brought participants to their office, they asked them to wait in that room for almost 35 seconds, and after 35 seconds they actually moved these participants to a different room. Here the participants were asked to tell about everything they saw in the earlier room. What do you think would have happened? The results showed that participants were highly likely to recall objects consistent with the office schema. So as soon as I mention office, you might already think about nowadays you can think about a table, an adjoining chair, maybe a cupboard. Nowadays you might say again inconsistent with the picture, nowadays you might think of a computer, a printer, stuff like that. So this, all of this stuff people very readily remembered. However, if you look back at this picture, you will see that there are some things here that are not consistent with the office schema. Say for example, there is a bottle of wine there, there is a picnic basket there, and there are some other things as well. So memory for these kind of objects in this room was slightly compromised. So very few people recall the wine bottle, very few people recall the coffee pot and the picnic basket, because these items were not consistent with the office schema. Again, this is a demonstration of how schemas might affect how you are taking a memory from a particular event or a situation, and how you are kind of being able to recall it later. So an interesting aspect of Brewer and Tyson's study was that some people in the study actually remembered items that were not even present in the room. For example, 9 people said that they remembered books, though there was no book. You can see here there is no book in this office. So this is again one of the example of how schemas might interfere in your recollection. Now other research has also shown that this happens almost all the time, and these kind of errors are referred to as schema consistent errors. And schema consistent errors kind of aggravate, they become more and more if the recall part is asked 2 days later, 3 days later. As much as the gap is there between the event and the recall, there are more chances of having these schema consistent errors. This one basically is also taken as an example of what is called a reconstruction error. The error is happening in the reconstruction of memory. So this is basically a schema consistent reconstruction error. Now also it has been shown that people have sometimes enhanced memory for schema inconsistent material. It's almost I'm presenting contrary findings from the earlier part, but that's what the literature has shown. So people have also reported remembering things better when they were inconsistent with the schema that they had about an event or a situation or a place. Say for example, things that completely stand out. Say for example, you go to a funeral procession, and there is somebody who is wearing very colorful clothes, and this person is very chatty, is laughing all the time and interacting with people. The behavior of this person will completely stand out with the rest of the people there who are probably in mourning, wearing either white or black clothes and stuff like that. So if you come across information like this, if you come across information that is entirely inconsistent with the schema of a particular event or a situation, uh, that is where you'll also recall this particular kind of information. So Davidson basically suggested, they basically conducted this interesting study where they asked participants to read a variety of stories describing very well known schemas, such as, for example, going to the movies. And these participants were reading these movies, and later they were asked to recall these recall these different stories. So the results demonstrated that people were especially likely to recall schema inconsistent events in these stories. So when they interrupted the normal and the expected story. Say, for example, one of the stories was about a woman named Sarah who goes to watch the movies, but during that when she goes to watch the movie, at some point in the cinema hall, there's a boy, there's a child who kind of comes and bumps into her, and say, for example, the popcorn she was carrying are spread on the ground. So these kind of events, which actually stand out of the expected scheme of things, are also remembered better. Now, another phenomena that I could talk about regarding schemas is called boundary extension. Now, boundary extension basically refers to our tendency to remember having viewed a greater portion of a scene that was actually shown. Say, for example, I show you a picture like this here, and I actually remove it, and then I ask you to describe in so many words about whatever you have seen in that picture. A lot of times it happens that people view these visual scenes, people view these scenes and events, and later when they are asked to recall, they kind of let their schemas interfere with their recollection of these scenes, with their recollection of these events. This is basically an example of boundary extension. Say, for example, if you have a schema, again the picture was of somebody's garbage area. So if you have a particular schema of somebody's garbage area, and I ask you later to draw this, or I ask you later to write about this, even if your memory might not be completely accurate for this particular thing, you might try and fill this up with whatever your schema tells that garbage areas have. So it's quite possible that in addition to the tin can and plastic canister that is there, you might also tell that there was filth lying around and so many other things. So this is basically what is an example of what is called a boundary extension. Now, Helene Intraub and colleagues actually did a lot of research on boundary extension, and they actually documented this phenomena for quite a long time. Let's talk about one of the studies they did. So Helene Intraub and Berkowitz basically in 1996 did the same experiment. They showed a number of college students a series of slides like the photo that I just showed you, and they showed this for very short time. They showed it for almost 15 seconds or even less, and then students were later asked to draw a replica of whatever they had seen. Now, it was seen in the results that participants consistently produced a sketch that had extended the boundaries beyond the presented scene. So extending the boundaries basically mean that you try and that you eventually end up drawing a lot more that is already presented in the scene. So that's basically what boundary extension is about. So according to Intraub and colleagues, and what they reasoned is that people comprehend a photograph by activating what is called a perceptual schema. If you're looking at a particular photograph, which let us say you can take the office photograph as an example, or you can take the last photograph of the garbage area as an example, or nowadays in social media, Facebook, etc., you see so many photographs. So the idea is you automatically activate a sort of a perceptual schema. It's almost like a framework using which you are actually navigating through that scene. So you almost, sometimes somebody shared a photo of theirs vacationing at a particular beach, you automatically picture and you automatically start in some sense collecting information that is sometimes not already there, and that information is supplied by your perceptual schema. So Entrop and colleagues reason that people comprehend a photograph by activating what is called a perceptual schema, which features as a complete central figure in the photo, and also includes mental representations of the visual information that is just outside the boundaries of the photo. Say, for example, if it's a beach scene, you might also already start imagining that you saw the sun setting, or say for example you saw people playing, or whatever your schema of a particular beach scenario might be. And again, your schema will be dependent on your memories or your experiences with the beach. Generally also, if you think of it, we use perceptual schemas when we look at real life scenes, as well as when we look at photographs, but sometimes based on our expectations, these perceptual schemas may actually be extending the boundaries of whatever is there in a particular photograph, or whatever is there at a particular scene. Now, this was basically, so Munger and colleagues, they say that this is almost like extending, beyond the edges of the photograph and beyond the scope of what our retinas would usually see. So, the boundary extension phenomena sometimes, and it has various applications, but one of the more interesting applications is that it also extends to explain errors in things like eyewitness testimony. If you remember, or if you go back and have a look at the last course where we talked about memory in a lot of detail, sometimes eyewitnesses they remember seeing things that they were actually not there during the crime scene, during when the crime was being committed. So, a lot of times what might happen is that witnesses may recall, say for example, having seen portions of the perpetrator's face, of the suspect's face, that wasn't really visible. People might come back and report with full confidence that they saw this person firing the bullet or using the knife, or something very similar to that, even though that thing might not have actually happened. Say for example, in a hypothetical scene, you see somebody being robbed by a group of people, and all of these group of people who are robbing are fairly well dressed, etc. But there is a other group of people standing nearby who are slightly shabbily clothed, who are really unkempt and not really looking up to the mark. And you come back, and after some time somebody asks you, did you see that robbing scene, were you there, could you be a witness? A lot of times it might happen that your memory can get confounded by things like boundary extension, and you might report that yeah, you saw this robbery being committed, and it was committed by people who were more shabbily dressed, etc. So, this can be again one of the examples of where boundary extension or the presence of schemas is modulating your organization of knowledge, or modulating your information uptake or information recollection from memory. I have been talking about how we are organizing your knowledge. One of the very important processes in organizing knowledge is abstraction. So, a lot of times you do not really remember things and events and situations in their complete detail. You do not remember the exact words of what was said. If you end up seeing this, the whole of this lecture, and 2 hours later somebody asks you, you saw that lecture on knowledge, and what was it all about? It's very likely that you'll not really remember word to word whatever I am saying here, but you might be able to give a good idea, a kind of a gist to the person that that today's class was about schemas, and this is what the broad idea about schemas is. So, this kind of activity, and something that we do all the time, is called abstraction. So, abstraction is a process of memory that stores the meaning of the message, but does not really store the exact message word by word. Okay. So, also, but there are other kinds of scenarios as well where people do have good memory, which is called verbatim memory. Generally, if you see, people will not have a very good word to word memory, but there are also some people who might say that I have a very good verbatim memory. Now, this thing, what this abstraction, what is it an example of? Abstraction basically is really about the constructive nature of memory. So, memory, as I have stressed enough in the last course when we were talking about memory at so much length, memory is not really passive organization of information. It's not really passive storing of information, or even if you're trying to recollect information, it's not like there is something kept on a shelf and you reach out with your hand and you take it up. It's not really like that. Memory is a very active process. Memory is very constructive in nature when you're trying to pull up information from the memory. So, memory abstraction, and we were also talking about boundary extension right now. All of them are examples of the constructive nature of memory. Bransford and Franks have actually done a lot of work about constructive nature of memory, and let me describe one of the studies that they did. So they asked the participants in their study to listen to sentences from several different stories. So these participants were listening to many different stories, many different versions, and then these participants were given a recognition test. Okay, the recognition test included some new items, some items that they had not seen earlier, but these were combination of earlier presented sentences. So many stories were there, those stories were made up of sentences, etc. And when the recognition test was given, they might have original items as well, and they had new items which were actually combination of original items. A lot of times people in the experiment, they told that they were highly convinced that they had seen these new items before, because these were combinations sometimes, but again these were not verbatim presented in the study earlier. This kind of error, when you're highly convinced that you have actually seen this something, seen this aspect earlier, you've been to this place earlier, etc., is called a false alarm. You've not been there, you don't really certainly remember this, but you kind of think that it was there and you remember it with a high degree of confidence. Bransford and Frank study actually showed that false alarm were very likely for more complex events, more complex sentences which were consistent with the original schema. Say for example, I am reading a story about, again if we can take the earlier example, the woman named Sarah was going to the movies. Now if there is a slightly more complex sentence there, say for example Sarah went to the ticket counter, bought the ticket, and then went to the restaurant and bought this food, and only then she returned to her seat in the theater. Now if I am giving you such a long sentence, and again both of these events that I mentioned in the sentence are consistent with your schema of going to the movies, you would basically have these false alarms. So if I have mentioned this entire thing in the recognition test, even though this was not present in the earlier story that I have presented you, you might kind of tell yourself that no, I have seen this information, this was certainly there. And why should it be there? Because again this is a story about somebody going to a movie, and people go to movies and have popcorns and buy tickets, and only then they buy tickets and have popcorns, and only then they come to to the seat and watch the movie. So more complex sentences anyways are slightly more difficult to process, but in case they are consistent with the original schema, there is a high chance that you will think that okay, this is something that I've already been with. Yeah. So most research other than Bransford and Franks also finds that similar things happen in a variety of different experimental scenarios. Now based on this kind of work, Bransford and Franks basically propose what is called the constructive model of memory. The constructive model of memory basically proposes that people integrate information from individual sentences in order to construct larger ideas. So if I am giving you a 10-minute talk in long sentences about a place I am going to visit, or about a place I have visited earlier, you might not really be interested in all the details, but you'll probably abstract, you'll take the gist out of this, and say for example tell to somebody else that this person went for vacation to X place. That is what people generally do, and that is what the constructive model of memory proposed by Bransford and Franks talks about. So they say that people integrate information from individual sentences in order to construct larger ideas. Later they believe that they have already seen those complex sentences, already been at that complex events, because they have combined these various facts in their memory. So what you have actually seen plus what you have kind of inferred because of your particular kind of schemas that are on work, you're kind of combining both of these things together. And when at a later time you are trying to recall this, maybe because you want to tell this story to a particular friend, it becomes very difficult to untangle these two things, what you have actually seen versus what your schema has told you. So that is again one of the problems with memory, but again this is what the constructive nature of memory is all about. There is another approach to memory, because we are talking about schemas, there is another approach to how schemas might influence memory. This other approach was given by Murphy and Shapiro in 1994, and they call it the pragmatic view of memory. So what is the pragmatic view of memory? The pragmatic view of memory is that people pay attention to the aspects of message that are most relevant to their current goals. Say for example, whatever I am talking about in this lecture, if I tell you that none of this is actually going to come in any of the assignments or any of the exams that you are going to give, you might not really be very inclined to remember this anyways, and that happens in classrooms all the time. But the idea is, as soon as I say that today's lecture will carry so much weight in a particular assignment or in a particular quiz that is going to happen, you will probably try and pay more attention to this, and you will try and kind of remember as much as you possibly can. So the pragmatic view of memory basically says that people pay attention to the aspect of the message that is most relevant to their current goals. In other words, people know that they would usually need to recall only the gist quite accurately, and so they can ignore the specific sentences. Now, however, as I was saying earlier, if they realize that they do need to pay attention to the exact wording, suppose I am asking you to write all of this down at some point in time, then their verbatim memory can also be quite accurate. Now, Murphy and Shapiro proposed this, and they actually conducted a study wherein they hypothesized that people are likely to pay attention to specific words in a sentence if the words are part of particular kinds of criticism or some kind of insult. Now, insult is something that pricks, insult is something that is socially very important. So, people are very likely to pay attention to when they are being insulted. So, that is what the pragmatic view of memory would tell you. So, what happened in this study? Participants were told to read letters that were presumably been written by this particular woman called Samantha, and Samantha writes 2 letters. One of these letters she writes to her cousin Paul, and she is actually describing her life circumstances, and maybe she has not met this person for a long time, and she is chatting about all the things in the world. And so this letter had but this letter had sentences like it never occurred to me that I would be a mother so early, etc., etc., etc. One of the interesting characteristics of this letter was that this letter was written in a very bland way, in a very morose, in a very colorless way, so to speak. So there were no exaggerations, no exclamations, etc., but a very plain letter. The other letter was written basically to her boyfriend Arthur, and 10 sentences in this. So this letter was actually very well designed. So 10 sentences in that letter were written in a very neutral, in a bland sort of way, the same way they appeared in Paul's letter. But in this letter, all of these 10 sentences were basically used in a very sarcastic context, in a very taunting kind of a manner. So, for example, the sentence "it never occurred to me that I would be a mother so young" was actually used when referring to Arthur's infantile behavior. So, the idea was, now it does not really mean a plain statement of fact, now it actually means insult to this particular person. So, herein the manipulation lies. Now, Murphy and Shapiro actually gave both of these groups. So, 2 different groups are reading these 2 different letters, and later Murphy and Shapiro are giving both of these groups a 14-item recognition test. So, they have to look at these 14 items and tell that whether these items had been presented earlier or not. 5 items were the original items, original sentences that were presented. 5 were paraphrased versions of these items. Say for example, the same sentence we have been talking about could be presented as I never thought that I would be a mother at such a young age. So, you have kind of extended it a little bit, paraphrased it. It is not the same sentence that was presented verbatim, and there were 4 irrelevant sentences just acting as fillers. So, what would you think would have happened? The results showed that people rarely made the mistake of falsely recognizing the irrelevant sentences. So, they did not really recognize that they were there. So, that is a good thing. But correct recognition was much higher for sentences that were presented in a sarcastic context than sentences that were not presented that were in the letter which was written to Paul. Also, people were making more false alarms for the paraphrases of bland sentences than for the paraphrases of sarcastic sentences. So, why are they getting confused with the bland sentence? They are getting confused with the bland sentences because they actually did not pay a lot of attention to it. As soon as the same sentences appeared in the letter written to Arthur, because there was a sarcastic context attached to it, they probably processed it better and they probably stored it better. Herein you can see the results. irrelevant sentences 4%, stochastic sentences 5%, and then you can see the hits and you can see the false alarms and the hits minus false alarms ratio. In reality, again, because I've been talking about the constructive nature in the constructive approach, in reality the constructive approach and the pragmatic approach to memory abstraction, if you actually look at them, are actually quite compatible. So there could be scenarios, say for example, where you need to integrate information from individual sentences to form a kind of a gist. There could also be scenarios where you would actually pay a lot of attention to specific details. So both kind of scenarios actually exist, and they probably apply in a compatible fashion to different situations. So there could be situations where you could apply the gist making strategy, and there could be places where you will apply the strategy of actually remembering everything in detail. Let us talk about how schemas affect the integration in memory. So schema theorists basically they've argued that a single integrated representation is created in memory from the information that was selected in the first phase, abstracted in a later phase, and then interpreted in a still later phase. So our memories are basically, if you look at it, they're not really just raw facts. They're not, so every, say for example, if you try and remember, I don't know at what time of the day you're watching this, say for example, you know, it's 7 o'clock in the evening and you're kind of you know, watching the same lecture, and if I'm asking you to recall whatever have happened in the day, you'll probably not recall each event separately in all its detail, but you'll have you'll kind of gist some of this part, you'll probably abstract it in a slightly later part, and in the end you'll try and interpret all of what has happened in the last phase. So schemas also influence the integration of events in memory. Some researchers have actually argued that schemas actually exert a much more powerful effect during this integration phase than during the earlier phases of memory. So schemas might not affect your information uptake so much, but they will have a very strong impact on how you are finally integrating and forming consolidated memories. So let us look at a couple of examples. There is sometimes a delayed recall kind of scenario. Say for example, a number of studies have shown that background knowledge may not encourage schema consistent integration if people are tested immediately after the material is learned. So if material is learned immediately, then the schemas might not be able to affect so much. So after a long delay, however, the schemas might play a more important role. So Harrison colleagues did this study in 1989, and they tried to replicate Bartlett's classic 1932 study, where he had a particular event narrated, and he asked people to come after different periods and just write back the same story. So in this experiment, in Harrison colleagues' experiment, they asked college students in Kansas, US, to read a story that was consistent with either the US culture or the traditional Mexican culture. So there was a representative story about planning a date in the traditional Mexican culture, and basically it included a sentence about a young man's older sister accompanying the couple as a chaperone. Now in the US culture, that's not something that happens usually, so the US culture's version did not have this chaperone thing. When the story recall was tested 30 minutes after reading the material, the students showed no tendency for the Mexican schema stories to shift in the direction to consistent with US schemas. Now because this is happening just 30 minutes later. However, when the same test is taken 2 days later, a lot of students have kind of shifted the boundaries towards either side. So the schema consistent errors are actually kicking in cases where delayed recall is being tested. It's not happening immediately, but when the integration is happening 2 days later, when you don't really recollect the entire details and you're trying to form a representation on your recollection and the interpretation of whatever has happened, that is where the schema is kind of kicking in much more strongly. Let's talk about a different scenario. People have also said that integration, when you're talking about limited capacity, that is also where the schemas come into play. So research suggests that schemas are more likely to influence memory integration when memory capacity is strained. So when people are doing so many different tasks at the same time. So Sherman and Besanoff basically found that people committed many schema consistent errors when they had to work on two simultaneous memory tasks. Say for example, they misremembered that pleasant words had been used to describe a priest, and whereas unpleasant words were used to describe a skinhead. In contrast, when people who were working uh, on a single memory task in their experiment did not show this schema consistent tendency of remembering. So, when your resources are slightly strained, when people have too many things on their mind, maybe there is a lot of stress, that is where the schemas might actually present a lot more influence than in some scenarios when people are more relaxed and they have time to work around these things. So, in summary, trying to sum up whatever we've talked about schemas till now, schemas do often influence memory integration, especially when there is a long delay prior to recall, and also when memory capacity is limited. So, I hope you gathered whatever about schemas, whatever about schemas we did in this class, and that is all from me about schemas. We'll talk about the next topic in the next section.